We're here with Carroll Bouchard, a Fort Kent native who's 60, I would think, 7 now, huh?
I'll be 67 in November.
Yeah. And Carroll, let's talk about your family a little bit. You're here from, you still live in Washington.
I still live in the Washington suburbs in Virginia, Northern Virginia.
And
Washington has been my home for the past 25 years.
So you were born here in Fort Kent. Yeah.
I was born here in Fort Kent. Both my father and mother were from Frenchville. My father was a dentist in Fort Kent.
Comment il s'appelait, lui?
Mac Bouchard.
Is that right?
Yes, and he died of a heart attack when I was 3 years old.
You must have been young.
I was just 3.
Non, mais lui?
37.
37.
37. And there were 5 children left. There were 3 boys and 2 girls. And 3 years after my father died, my oldest sister died of a brain tumor. She had been operated on in Boston a few times, but she died in 1945. So the remaining family is 2 brothers and a sister who still lives here in Fort Kent, Joanne Albert. And I have a brother, my oldest brother Jack is in Washington, and my oldest brother Jack is in Connecticut, and he's retired as well. And then my other brother, Don, is a retired dentist in Maryland.
So your sister there, how old was she when she died?
She died at 15.
Brain tumor.
A brain tumor over 3 years. She was treated at in Boston at hospitals. They operated twice, and then there was nothing else that they could do for her. So they brought her back by train to Fort Kent, and she
died here.
Died here in 1945.
Ça a-tu du bon sens? Now, your dad was awful young. Was he sick before?
No, he was in relatively good health. He was very active in the community, and he was a well-known baseball player with the local team. And
he was a fisherman. I have a picture of him.
That's right. He was a fisherman, and Ed Doyle, who used to be one of the state troopers in Fort Kent, and my father were very good friends. And they had a lot of hunting and fishing trips. And
yeah, Ed Doyle used to be the policeman in this area.
That's right, yes.
Because when we saw him coming, il avait un bicycle à gaz. Now, I've seen a picture of somebody in a motorcycle with sleds or something with... Your father didn't use that, but Ed Doyle did. It was like a skidoo there.
That's right, yeah.
Way back.
Right, way back.
Puis il n'y avait pas rien que lui, il y avait le Dr. Savage, je pense.
C'est ça. Dr. Savage was another very close friend of my father's. Yeah.
Now, in the winter, when they had to go somewhere, the roads were not open and all that.
No, the roads were not opened, and they had a tough time. The doctors at that time even used to travel together. You know, my father's office downtown here before he died was with Dr. Toussaint. And very often doctors and dentists at that time did a lot of country visits. And they would travel together and go up towards the Allagash and in lumber camps. And
now, their office, was it next to where the telephone company is? Or what?
That's right, yeah.
It's a gray, big building there.
Yeah, it was just as you come down Pleasant Street now to turn, not to go over the Fish River Bridge.
Yeah.
It was right in front of that. It was the office building à Georges-Émile Monod.
See, across the street from Quigley, now.
Right across the side street from Quigley. Yeah, Georges-Émile Monod, puis they had the insurance company on one side, and my father and Dr. Toussaint had a joint waiting room, and then they had their offices there. Yeah.
And Dr. Unks probably took his place because I know they were together for a while. Toussaint and Unks.
Because Toussaint, after my father died, Toussaint had to go to war, and he served in the Philippines.
Really?
Yes.
So your father died, let's say he was 37. What year are you talking
42.
about? 42.
42.
Tu as 23 ans.
So that's was I just turned 3, and he died a few weeks after that.
Le bébé de la famille.
Bébé de la famille.
Now, one of your brothers has a condition. C'est
Yeah,
Don?
my brother Don.
And he was a dentist.
He's a dentist, and he 25 years ago, almost 25 years, 24 years ago now, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And he has had a very difficult time at the very beginning, in the first years. But he was very fortunate to be in the Washington area with the best of care, with the top medical people, especially at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And after having gone through an experimental program for people with multiple sclerosis, an experimental program in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in decompression chambers like they use for divers. That helped Don. It stopped where he was going. His medical situation was going down. It leveled off. So over the past 20 years, he gets around very well. He has a mobile cart in the trunk of his car, but he walks with a cane. And he considers himself very lucky to have had good treatment and to be followed up. And now he's being followed up, through the Veterans Administration also because he was a veteran. And
well, I see him every year.
He tries to come. He tries to come up here,
and he looks the same every year.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, he's doing. Don is 3 years older than I am.
You would think it'd get worse every year, but he doesn't seem to.
In many cases, they do. But like I say, in his particular case, he was forced to retire, being totally disabled. But he's been able to handle it very well with the right care.
And he was a dentist even through this. He was
no. He was a dentist. Don, he was very interesting. Don was in the military, was in Korea, and then he came to Washington and started going through school. And he had a political patronage under Senator Muskie from Maine, where he worked at the Capitol as a Capitol police detective at night. He'd go through dental school during the day, and he'd go to work out of Muskie's office at 11 at night to 7 in the morning.
Wow.
And
that's how he
graduated from Georgetown Dental School in 1966.
So that's how he went through school.
That's how he went through school. And in fact, at the same time that Don was working his way through school through Muskie's office, George Mitchell, who is very well known now, former senator from Maine, former majority leader of the Senate, just recently retired as chairman of the board of Walt Disney. George Mitchell also had a political patronage from Muskie, and he would work for Muskie during the day as a legislative assistant, and he'd go to law school at night.
Mitchell?
George, yeah.
Oh.
And George and Don are good friends, and I know George very well also.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now he's trying to fix baseball right now. The steroid.
Oh, yes. Well, George Mitchell, since he left the Senate, has served the country very well.
Yeah.
He's a special ambassador for Northern Ireland. He's the one that helped resolve those, the terrorist situation there for 25 years. He's been a special ambassador for the Middle East also. And but his love is baseball. There's a lot of people that thought that he could, if he would have wanted to, he could have been baseball commissioner.
Yeah, I think so. I heard about that.
And then there's also well-known rumor in Washington that he turned down a seat on the Supreme Court
Yeah.
of the United States.
And there was rumor, too, that he might run for president.
He would have been a good candidate.
Yeah.
He's very well respected.
Yeah.
Maine has been very fortunate in the people that have represented Maine in Washington. You go back to people without going that far, but Margaret Chase Smith, Ed Muskie, George Mitchell, Bill Cohen, and now you're represented by two excellent women in the Senate.
Yeah.
And Olympia Snowe in particular is, whenever they rate senators in Washington, they rate the top 10 senators or the top 5 senators. Olympia is in that range. And Susan, in the past a few years, with the important position she has as the chairman of the Governmental Affairs and Homeland Security Commission, has really developed an excellent reputation as well.
Yeah, they're all over the news, you know, like national news.
Right.
CNN, CBS.
That's right.
You see Susan Collins on there.
You see Susan more
Snow.
because Olympia, everyone wants Olympia, but Olympia, different personality. Olympia is behind the scenes. She does a lot of things, but whenever one of the news programs is fortunate enough to have Olympia appear on their program, people listen. When Olympia Snowe, she doesn't speak very much, but when she speaks in Washington, people listen.
So the little state of Maine has always had, well, most of the time has
That's
had.
right. No, they've had good people. They've been well represented, and you know, I remember Ed Muskie years ago. When I was a teacher here at the high school, and you know, I've always been a Republican. And I would go and visit my brother Don, and I knew everyone in Muskie's office. And I'd go with a list of books that I wanted, you know, the senator's office to provide me for my classes here at the high school, because I was teaching political geography, constitutional law, and Canadian history.
In Fort Kent High School.
At the community high school from 61 to 68. So I'd go ask them. Well, I'd say, you know, this is the list of books, you know, can you get me these? Because the government, you know, the senators could get these books for free and ship them. And they'd always let me have some, but they'd kid me. They said, why don't you go see Margaret Chase? I remember once Muskie came out and heard that, and he kiddingly said to his staff, listen, you give Carroll anything that he wants. He says, I want you all to remember one thing. When I was first elected to political office in the state of Maine, there weren't enough Democrats to elect me to anything. The Republicans put me in office. So, you know, that was Ed Muskie for you.
That was a big thing, because I remember I was in high school in 1954, and Muskie won, which was, I think the Republicans had been in for 100 years, governor and everything else. And then in 1950, I think governor then was just 2 years, huh?
Yes, yeah.
So he ran back in 56, and in 58, he had the mayor of Waterville as his, well, he went to the Senate. And the mayor of Waterville went for governor.
Right.
His name was Clinton Clausen.
Oh, yes, yeah. Clausen.
Remember him?
Sure, yes, yeah.
Well, Clinton Clausen went to this same school as me. He was a chiropractor.
Oh, really?
And I think he's the only chiropractor who ever became governor of a state. But he didn't do it on himself. He went on the coattails of Muskie. He starts in 58, and he's governor, Clinton Clausen, for a year. And I'm up here. I'm going to chiropractic college at the time. And I'm here, and my uncle Black Joe, who owned the sporting club, he comes to my house. I think it was New Year's Day. He said, Clausen just died last night. He was in office just 1 year.
Oh, he died in office. You know, I had forgotten that.
Yeah, he dropped dead either New Year's Eve or New Year's Day.
Yeah.
So he was in just 1 year, and but he was, I think, well, of course, Muskie, you know, went for the Senate.
And 58 went into and then made a distinguished career in the Senate.
Yeah.
And then, of course, ended up as, although just for a short period, but ended his career as Secretary of State.
Yeah. And was it after that he ran for president, or before that? Do you remember?
Before that.
I don't know who he was running against.
Not Nixon.
It was Nixon. Nixon.
So it's.
I think Nixon.
Wow.
because
It was in the primary, everyone thought that he would get the Democratic primary. And then in New Hampshire, he ran into trouble, where there's always the famous snow scene where he's standing, and they say he was mad at the press because the press had gotten mad. The press had written something about his wife Jane because she'd told them a little off-colored joke, on a press strip. And he got out there and he said, "You can say anything you want about me, but you're not, don't attack my wife."
Yeah. And he cried, or they were not sure if it was tears.
It was cry or if there was tears.
Or maybe snow was melting on his glasses.
But that was just the thing that derailed.
It didn't. It's funny how things happen.
Things happen. You see, this is the thing with national politics. It's main politics are interesting as well, and I'm sure we all have many stories. But national politics, things can change very quickly from day to day.
Yeah, over something like that. Had nothing to do with his qualifications.
No.
Nothing to do with war or politics. He cried because
because someone attacked his wife.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an attack. It was,
but he overreacted.
He overreacted.
Yeah. So, Carroll, you're brought up. You're born in 39 or 40?
39.
39. So what do you remember about Fort Kent as your childhood there?
Oh, my childhood in Fort Kent was a very interesting childhood that I hold so many fond memories, because there were 8 friends, very close friends, from the time we started in kindergarten and first grade. There were 3 that were 1 year older, and then there were 5 of us. Like, Leah Robichaud and myself and Bob Burgoyne, Jerry Toussaint, Don Michaud, Mike and Bruce Collins, and Spike Collins. We were always together. We were in the Boy Scouts together. We used to go to Camp Roosevelt. We had what is known now up on the hill, Scout Valley at one time, but it was originally called Sears Camp.
Sears Camp?
It was Sears Camp because it was Maurice and Norman Sear that built a little camping area on a brook when they were young, because they used to live in that, in that area. Well, we would spend as much time as we could up there. In fact, just the other night, I had an interesting dinner with 2 of those other people, and we get together. These, of course, we lost one of our group in Don Michaud.
Don Michaud died in 1980.
In that plane crash with Bob Jalbert.
1980.
Who used to be our scoutmaster.
Really? Oh yeah, Bob. Bob Jalbert was. Yeah.
But the 7 of us, although we're spread, up and down the East Coast and to Texas, still are in touch 2-3 times a year, and we get together and.
Now, Bob Burgoyne was up here this week.
Yes, he just left. He just left to go back.
He bought a camp on Eagle Lake.
But it was funny. Bob bought, when he retired from the government a few years ago, he was a lawyer. He was the general counsel of the Federal Maritime Commission. He bought a beautiful historic home on Cape Cod and built an addition to it. But Cape Cod, during July and August, there's so many people there. So he had been coming up here and saying, well, if I find a place on Eagle Lake, what I'm going to do is come spend, July and August up here. Well, he just bought a camp last year, and he and Beth were just up here for a few weeks.
So just 2 weeks, huh?
Well, about 2.5 weeks. I think they came on the 18th, and they had to go back yesterday because Beth who still works in Washington, has a conference starting on Tuesday. So,
they haven't spent as much time as they thought they would.
No, but eventually the idea is that, they spend at least 5 or 6 weeks here in the summertime.
Puis Bob Bourgoin, ça c'est le garçon à qui ça?
C'est le garçon Alice Bourgoin.
Alice
Bourgoin was the town clerk for many years.
Yeah, because I remember her. Everybody must know her.
Everyone knew Alice Bourgoin. She was not only the town clerk, she was also the draft board representative
Oh
for Fort
boy,
Kent.
Raymond, t'as dit.
Yeah, and she was the draft board was in Caribou. Katrina Anderson. So back then we all knew who Katrina Anderson
I
was.
remember that name.
Wow, Alice Bourgoin was the town clerk, and Bob's father also died very young.
Yeah, because I don't remember him.
Yeah, no.
C'est qui faisait, t'en rappelles-tu?
I think he was an electrician.
Puis il est mort jeune.
He more then when Bob was just about 3-4 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
Same time as your dad.
Yeah.
Alice, là, qu'est-ce qu'elle faisait, là, comme, on va dire, draft?
She was the local. Her main job was the town clerk of Fort Kent. And she was for years.
Puis là, il était quasiment
Puis
tout seul. Là,
ouais.
Il n'avait pas une gang. Là.
Il n'y avait pas de gang, non. Puis l'affaire que c'est, and then she had her daughter, by her first marriage, we called her pet. Her name was Florella Roy, who worked with her mother.
Fleur Roy, tu dis?
Roy. Alice's first. Alice had been married twice. She had been married to a Roy, and she had Pet.
Okay.
And then he died, and she married Bourgoin.
Okay.
And that's Bob's father.
Puis il y a eu un garçon.
Yeah, un garçon. Yeah.
Puis Bob était comme dans ta classe. Lui,
1 year ahead.
Okay.
Of our group of 8, 3 were 1 year ahead. And 3 of them, for instance, are having their 50th high school reunion this year. And a lot of them, Mike Collins had his in Fort Kent, and Leo Robichaud and Bob Burgoyne are having theirs at Assumption in Worcester in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
And the rest of us were for next year's our 50th high school.
Ça, c'est la même année que moi, ça.
Quelle année?
56.
Toi, c'est 56. Nous autres, c'est 57.
I left St. Agathe in the 8th grade, and so I don't have a class reunion ever. You know, because I went to St. Francis High School, and the high school doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
But this year in St. Agathe, they had a 50th, and I went there.
Oh, really? Talking about St. Agathe, I saw the other night that excellent publication that you put out on St. Agathe.
Oh, the book?
Yes, yes, because I was even surprised. I had not realized, as much as Mike Collins and I have been, and his brother Bruce, we've been close friends since we were 4 or 5 years old. I had not realized that Mike and Bruce had gone to St. Agathe for 1 year. So Mike says, not only that, but I'm on the cover of the publication.
Oui. Yeah, ça a pas duré longtemps. A lot of people from Fort Kent went to the convent in St. Agathe, you know. Yeah. And some of them went there because it was supposedly to make you better educated. And others was prestige. If you could afford $1 a day to send your child there, it was quite a thing. And then others went there to get rid of them, you know. Les grosses familles, là, ils envoyaient tout ça là. Mais yeah, Mike went there. Now Burgoyne, lui, là, he retired. Puis,
Bob retired 10 years ago.
Oh, he did?
Because Bob went to Assumption Prep, then he went to Catholic University.
In Washington.
In Washington for undergraduate and law school. And right after law school, he went to work for the government as a lawyer.
So he's been there all the time.
And he was 35 years.
Yeah.
And he was with the Federal Maritime Commission.
Ça fait longtemps qu'il est parti de Fort Kent, lui.
Ah oui, yeah. And he, for a long time after his mother died, he didn't come because the only relative basically that he had up here was Tsouil-Willette.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But
Tsouil's been dead 20 years.
Right. But then he started coming back about 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I met him at the camp there one time, and he just got married.
Just got married last fall to a friend of his that he went out with her. She was a government lawyer also, and she still is. She's now executive director of the American Bankers Association. Bob and Beth went out on and off for 25 years, so it was last July when we all got a notice to reserve the date. They were getting married on Cape Cod.
After all these years?
After all these years. So
where's she from?
She's originally from Ohio. Her parents live in California now. but she went to law school in South Carolina, and then came to Washington. And she also had she had presidential appointments in the Republican administrations when I first met her.
Now, you talked about your brother Don, and now there's another one that's called Jack.
Right. My older brother Jack is 75. He's retired. He's been retired about 10 years now. In Connecticut, he was with United Technologies, a division of, used to be the old Pratt & Whitney, and then he worked for Standard Hamilton, and retired years ago, and he and his wife have a home in Connecticut and a home in Florida, so they go back and forth.
Now, so everybody left town there except for your sister.
Everyone left town except Joanne,
who
was married to Rod Albert, and so we always had always have a place to come back to. And my mother, after my father died, my mother went to work for many years for J.C. Penney. She was the head of the women's department. In the old J.C. Penney store in Fort Kent, when you used to walk in the back was about a second story, about 1/3.
Yeah.
And that was my mother's area. She was there, and she worked there until she retired at 65. And our home used to be on River Street. And when they started the dike. The business, the dike was not going to come on the other side of the Fish River.
Oh, yeah.
We had, they wanted to buy all of those houses. And I felt very strongly that I supported the project. But I remember telling the people who were in charge in town that, we'd sell. But after, it was difficult at that time to find apartments in Fort Kent.
Yeah.
And my mother had lived all of these years right near the church, and she used to help the nuns with the sacristy, and then she was a Eucharistic minister. And then finally, when the apartment above Peter's Florist came open.
Right on the corner.
Right on the corner.
Church Street? Is that Church Street?
It was on Church Street, corner of Church Street.
Now the next street, Sea River.
Sea River.
Okay.
So when she moved there, that's when we sold the house to the town, and they tore it down. It was such a big house that it could not have been moved.
Oh, okay.
Like some of them were.
So we're talking about mid-70s.
No,
when this was done.
At that time, you're talking about early 80s, because I was in Africa when I was negotiating with the town, and on the house sale. So that was.
Ça a pris un peu de temps, ça.
Ça a pris un peu de temps, puis they were very, very cooperative and everything else. But I felt very strongly, j'ai dit, well, I'm not going to sell the house, and then first we have to find a suitable place for my mother. And we're very lucky. My brothers and I have always been very fortunate and thankful to my sister and Rod, who were always here and close to my mother. And then it also gave us the opportunity of coming back and visiting often.
Well, what I remember is the last big flood we had, and we had chunks of ice on Main Street that were as big as cars. That was 1974, and I think that's when they decided to build a dike. But it took a few years to...
Well, that's when they decided, you see, to build the dike on the town side.
West Main Street.
Right, but when the Army Corps of Engineers looked at what the cost would have been to build the dike on East Main Street, going down to the bottom of Station Hill.
Where Rite Aid is.
Right, it was not economically feasible or viable to do something like that.
Oh, okay.
So that's when they approached the homeowners with this idea of having a good fair value price. But you see, they didn't totally force everyone, because if you look in that area, there are some people on St. John Street and even on River Street. There's still a house there that was never sold, and a few houses on Church Street.
Yeah, and I think St. John, doesn't George Picard
Oui,
live on St.
George
John's
Picard, puis on River, puis on Alfred Street, là,
Right.
you sais que dit Wedette Restel, that's still there, puis the Potvin House on R Street. So,
Il y avait Martin Street et tout.
yes, yeah, Little Martin Street.
Ça fait qu'ils ont fait Riverside Park avec ça.
That's right.
That's
Very close to the river. They did Riverside Park, so that if there's flooding, it wasn't. But when I was young, the water would come up River Street. We'd have some water in the basement, and never came out on the floor of the main house.
Never did.
No. May we used at that time with the furnaces, the wood furnaces. We'd have the wood brought in, and we'd cord the wood up in the basement. For the winter heating, we'd have it would flood, and then we'd have to get that.
La fournaise, là, ça me...
La fournaise, ça flottait.
Ça flottait, puis
Ouais.
elle marche encore pareil.
Ben oui, but later on, of course, with
had
the
to fix-
oil, we went into the oil,
Yeah.
got rid of the wood furnaces.
So flooding in Fort Kent was an annual thing almost.
It was an annual thing in town, but not that much. I don't remember on Main Street on the business district. The ones on the right side of the road, closer to the river, the
Yeah.
stores, they'd get flooded. I don't. And River Street and Church Street, around the church, I remember seeing water come up, not totally around the church. Come up close to the back of it, la sacristie des Enfants de Chœur.
Well, I remember worse than that. I think you were gone by then. I remember where water was across the main street in front of the church, joining up with the Fish River.
Yes, I was.
Were you here then? And then Hall Street in front of a theater.
Yeah.
And I remember the bridge going to Clare was
Yeah,
closed.
Yeah.
C'était le temps qu'il fasse quelque
Oui,
chose.
puis c'était le temps qu'il fasse quelque chose.
Yeah.
And it was a good, good project.
Yeah. Now, your sister married Dr. Rod Albert.
Right?
Ça, c'était-tu des high school sweethearts, ça?
Pas high school. They met during high school. Rod was at Assumption, at Assumption Prep.
In
And
Worcester.
then in Worcester, and then at Assumption College.
Okay.
And it's when it was at Assumption College that they started going out. And they then were married, and then they went to Quebec. He went to Laval Medical School.
That's where he was, he has a medical education at
His
Laval?
medical, yeah, at Laval. His father had gone to Laval, and Rod went to Laval.
Son père s'appelait Léon.
Léonce, Dr. Léonce,
Il venait de Saint-François, je pense.
Saint-François.
He died young, lui, too. Léon,
ben-
67, je pense.
Something like, yeah.
Puis Rod et
Yeah,
tout, il était
yeah,
pas vieux, hein?
yeah.
How old was Rod when he...
Rod, 70.
70,
69.
yeah. Après ça, il était à St. Francis Hospital in Connecticut, je pense?
Well, yes, for his pediatric residency.
Oh, okay.
So when he went from Laval. But it was when he was at Laval that a tour company out of New York sent someone to Quebec to see if they had any Canadians who spoke English, because they wanted to start motor coach bus tours around the United States and Canada for Americans and to bringing Europeans in. So they got to Laval, and at Laval they found out not only did they have some Canadians who spoke English, but that they had Americans who spoke French. And the company hired Rod and Lee Giguère from Waterville, who were both medical students who had families and a couple of kids living in Quebec. They hired them to work in the summertime, running bus tours out of New York City into the maritime provinces and the Gaspé and Nova Scotia and Quebec. So it was good for them because 3 days out of every 2 weeks they'd be home with the family in Quebec. But when the time came that they had to go into their residency, they couldn't do that anymore.
That was a full-time.
Bad in the summer, they couldn't even do it in the summer.
Yeah.
So Maurice Albert, Rod's brother, and I took their place working for this tour company in New York.
What year was that?
1959.
What a job.
And
Huh?
to me, this is what my being able to speak French, because the company wanted someone that could speak French, and that's how Rod had gotten it. This is what basically changed my career from, I was very happy. In 59, I was still in college here at Fort Kent.
You went to college here.
For 3 years. And then, since they didn't give a degree here, we went to get our degrees we could go to the University of Maine, or you could go to Farmington State Teachers College.
So what was the university here, what was it known as in the...
Well, it started out as the Madawaska Training School. And then the name changed to the Fort Kent State Normal School.
That's when you were there?
While I was there, it was called the Fort Kent State Normal School. In 1962, it became the Fort Kent State Teachers College. Then later it became Fort Kent State College. And then it became part of the university system, so now it's known as the University of Maine at Fort Kent.
But in 59, they didn't give a degree.
No, they only started giving degrees, I believe the first year they gave a degree is either 62 or 63. So in our graduating class of about a little over 30 in 1960, 9 of us went to Farmington and 4 went to Presque Isle.
Okay.
And the others started teaching right away and eventually got their degrees. But there were 9 of us, 9 guys from Fort Kent that went to Farmington.
Yeah, boy, the college has changed. It's improved.
It sure has changed over the years.
You're talking about a...
I remember when I was in high school and we were fighting to keep it open. This was at the time when they wanted to close it. And I remember once...
But you were talking about...
About when I were, the importance of how many people in the valley got their education and started out in teaching, and others eventually branched out into other fields, but they at least got a start in a college education at the Madawaska Training School.
So we're lucky to have it.
We were lucky to have it. And in the mid-50s, there was a move on to close it. And it was the valley and the people got together. And in fact, I was in high school, this must have been in 1956. And there was a big snow blizzard, and there were cars from Fort Kent, a big delegation that went down. And a person who came to be a top educator in the St. John Valley here, Rena Sutherland, married to Mel Labby. She taught for many years in Madawaska. She gave a speech at the Maine legislature at that time that we think is what was the turning point for our saving.
Is that right?
Our being able to save.
And she was just in high school?
She was just in high school. She's represented, the high school people who said that, if you close that, we probably won't have the opportunity to go to school.
Yeah.
And, yes, that speech that Rena gave the Maine legislature was really something. And then, of course, she went on to teach for many years in Madawaska and won all types of state and national awards. And was recognized as...
And her husband became superintendent?
Mel Labby became superintendent. And, people, the community in the valley have always supported and really been behind saving the university. And then John Martin, who's a friend, although we're political opposites in many ways, but John Martin has got to be given a lot of credit for having led the fight on the political scene in Augusta itself to stop.
Well, John's been responsible for a lot of improvements up here.
Oh, he sure has.
Including Route 11.
Yeah, no. Listen, the thing is that John, although I've been away most of the time, because I left here in 1968, but I've always been up here at least once or twice a year, and I've always followed, everything that John has done. So, but he's played a significant role in keeping and spearheading to keep the college going to where it is, and it's developed into an excellent institution that is now being ranked as a very favorable, small college. And I understand that they probably have about 1,000 students there. And in my day there was less than 100.
I heard one time in the mid-50s they had 50 students.
Yes.
Yeah. C'est pas gros.
No.
Now, when I came to town in '63, and I think we went through a couple of fights.
That's right, even at the time.
One of them was fought very hard by Bob Jalbert and Marcella Violet of Van Buren with her senator husband, Elmer Violet.
Yeah.
There's been support from the entire St. John Valley.
Yeah.
And what an asset this is to Fort Kent today.
That's right.
I mean,
oh yes, because when you look at the role of the college and then the university and the people that it has brought, the valley has changed.
Yeah.
And I think that it's interesting, and I think that. One other interesting thing that I just had a discussion on in the past few days on this visit, I was amazed that as far as teachers, I've been told that as far as teachers at the University of Maine at Fort Kent now, most of the teachers are Canadian students coming in from Canada. So in the education component of the 1,000 students, education probably is only 25 or 30%. They have a very strong nursing school. They have a very strong environmental studies program. But I was amazed when I found out that of the student teachers and the teachers, the students in education, that most of them were Canadians.
Yeah. Well, we're very fortunate. So. It's been, it's brought us some diversity. It brought us some seeing other people and understanding other cultures and everything. And I think it's great, and I hope it keeps on growing.
Yes, I think it's great, and I think that those of us who graduated from there are proud to be associated with it. And if you go back and you look at the alumni. Now of the University of Maine at Fort Kent, you see people who have been very successful in all fields, not only education, but who used their education here as a base to go on to do something else.
Oh, that's a fact.
I left education. I enjoyed education for 7 years.
So you graduated from Farmington and came back here to teach?
I graduated from Farmington in 1961, and I came to teach at the high school in Fort Kent. And while I was teaching, you see, I was already involved in the summertime with the Casser Tours that I had started working for.
That's what Rod Albert was doing.
That's right.
So then let's talk about that a little bit. That must have been quite a thing.
Well,
you traveled all over.
I traveled all over. I started in 1959 with them, and of course they wanted me to work to develop tours into Quebec, basically, and the Maritime provinces.
From New York?
From New York. But I saw that this was a big national tour company, and two of the things that they had tours around the United States and Canada. But I wanted to see the U.S., so one year we had a 30-day tour out of New York City with Europeans, basically, going around visiting the national parks in the northern part of the United States of Seattle. And then in Seattle, they'd fly back to New York, and we'd fly in a new group, and the bus driver and I would continue for another 30 days. So I got to see the United States, basically, as a tour company, a tour escort. Every city we'd stop at, we'd hire local guides and everything. And then, my the boss, the owner of the company in New York, said to me, Quebec City, everyone talks Montreal. We're running tours to Montreal, and that's working very well. And this Quebec City, we have to do something there. And at that time, there was no question of being able to get bus tours into the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec. We stayed next door at the Clarendon Hotel. And I would run a bus tour out of New York, leaving on a Saturday morning, working our way up to Burlington, Vermont. And then we'd go into Quebec City for 3 days. And then we'd come back through the White Mountains. And it was a 7-day tour. We'd leave New York on a Saturday morning, come back on a Friday, and then I'd leave on another tour like this.
So it was a full time?
It was. The minute school closed here, I went there. But you have to remember that at that time, the schools closed from August 15th to September 15th. No, we went to school. Schools opened August 15th.
Yeah.
And closed September 15th to October 15th for potato harvest. So I would then fly back to New York and start working fall foliage tours for the company.
Yeah.
And then also, this tour company was a big outfit. And in the fall, some of their friends they would like to send off on little private vacations. So for about 5 years, in the fall, while people were picking potatoes up here, I was back in New York. I'd run a few fall foliage tours into New England or something, but I would also be a social escort to 3 or 4 couples who were friends of the company owners. That's how I got to Bermuda, through the Caribbean, Hawaii, Mexico. I just go with these people to sign bills for the company, make sure anything that they wanted was paid for and everything else.
Free, huh?
And then
Plus you're
I
getting
was
paid.
making money. Now
Yeah.
listen, that with the tour company, with the tours, working on the tours, I would make more money in 10 weeks than I made teaching the 36 weeks.
Isn't that so?
Because those were the days when if you had a bus load of people, every place you stopped, the bus driver and the tour conductor got a commission.
Oh.
There was only one place I never accepted a commission from, and it was in Quebec City, on the Grand Allée coming down towards the Chateau Frontenac. There's a convent that still exists, although it's very small enough, of cloistered white missionary nuns. And they used to have a little store where they sold embroideries and they sold pictures made with used postage stamps and everything else. And I would stop the bus there. This was the first place that my bus stopped that I directed people into a gift store in Quebec City. And the nuns, of course, because some of the other buses that stopped there, they still wanted their 10 or 15% off the cash register tape. I would tell the nuns, I want any commission in prayers. So the nuns would...
So on this bus tour, wherever you went, you'd stop somewhere.
Right.
You'd get a commission. And the bus driver too?
The bus driver and the tour conductor worked together. So if you stopped, we had our regular, on different tours, established restaurants.
Okay.
So we'd stop for lunch, and we would get a free lunch, and then we'd get 10% basically of the tape of what the people had bought.
Okay.
And at the evening, we were in a hotel, and we would always encourage people to eat outside of the hotel, because the hotel was paid for by the company. It was part of the tour, but we would steer. Well, when it got to Quebec City, I knew every restaurant in Quebec City, and there, we would, we made We made commissions on everything.
You bring a bunch of tourists over there.
Right.
They knew you had brought them there.
That's right.
And so it was understood that you'd get 10% after.
10%, sometimes 15%.
Isn't that something?
And then, of course, with me in Quebec, being so close to Quebec City here,
Yeah,
I would, in the wintertime, you remember how we were always going to Quebec?
yeah.
And so when I was in Quebec without a bus tour, I was still known by those restaurants. In the wintertime, I'd go to Quebec and I'd eat, for years at the best restaurants, the Continental, La Chaumière, all of these places in Quebec. Year round, they knew me. And then, of course, the nightclubs in Quebec, La Porte Saint-Jean, that was my biggest moneymaker.
Is that right?
Oh, boy, because there not only did I sell the bus tour, the nightclub tours to my 40 passengers on the bus, but, they paid for the show and the meal. And I got a percentage off anyway. And any drinks were supplemental. So our arrangement with the bus, with the Porte Saint-Jean was, invariably, out of 30 people in the nightclub, at least 10 people would say to their waiters when they ordered a drink, bring Carroll and Jabby a drink and put it on my tabs. So the bus driver and I would sit, separated away from them at a little table there. And the waiter walked by and he said, the second couple on the left over there, And then when they brought him their drinks, we'd lift our drink. And we were drinking the most expensive thing in the house was the most expensive cognac that they had with a beer. So they charge. And what they do is they'd put this on a list. They'd put this on the side. And then in the wintertime, when I'd go to Quebec, that's what I would drink. So my friends and I.
So you didn't drink it all the time. You would have been drunk.
No. But they charged the people.
What?
But they put it on a master tab.
Oh.
So in the wintertime,
so you had like
I'd send the
credit.
tab upstairs. Oh,
you had a credit for a long time.
This was, and I did that did the tours for 10 years.
Now, how much were you earning as a teacher?
Well, we were talking about that last night. When the contracts, in 1961, when Andy Frechette was the superintendent.
In Fort Kent.
In Fort Kent. He wanted me to come teach at the high school. And the most that they were paying $3,800 for 36 weeks. Caribou was paying $4,000. And downstate, you were getting $4,200. So I kept telling Andy, matter of principle, I'm not signing a contract less than $3,800, less than $4,000. And I was holding off. And then I'd see him, and I say, well, I'm talking to Falmouth, outside of Portland. I was in Norfolk down there. Finally, he says, come see me tomorrow morning. I go into his office, he's on the phone, calls me in, and then pushes a contract in front of me. It's still $3,800. I shoved it back to him, and I started to get up and walk out. He sat me down, and he had a piece of paper in his hand. He puts that in front of me, and it was $200 to be the audiovisual coordinator. He said, what in the hell does this mean? He says, just make sure you don't leave a room with the light on. And so that's
how you
how
started at 4,000.
That's how I started at 4,000. But then in the teachers club, in the teachers association, I was elected the head of the negotiating committee for the next year for, a rate, an increase. So when it got through, the base went up to 4,200. So everyone went from 3,800 to 4,200. I went from 4,000 to 4,200.
Oh, yeah.
So when we signed with the school board, the Teachers Association and school board signed the agreement, Andy Frechette was kidding me. You got a nice big raise, but not as much as the others.
C'est pas drôle, hein?
But you see, the
4000 piastres.
Yeah, but at that time, you see, we were involved with the JCs,
Yeah.
and the JCs, through the JCs, because I spoke French and I was riding around these buses, every place I'd stop, I'd check to see if there was a JC chapter, and I'd get to meet them, have a drink with them at night or something, and got known basically because in the main JCs and the New England JCs because I spoke French. And in 1964, there was a World Congress of JCs in Oklahoma City. And in Canada, you had a situation where the Canada JCs wanted to split in two, in a French-speaking organization and an English-speaking organization. And the international organization, of course, did not want that. The United States JCs knew it was going to be a big political thing. So I had some friends who were already on the national board of directors. So they got after me to go to this World Congress in Oklahoma City. But this started right after Harvest had closed. So in 1964, I had to go to Andy and the school board and ask to have 2 weeks off to go to the World Congress.
Now, you know, this is a different world from 40 years ago.
Yeah.
JCs, to most people, doesn't mean a thing.
Doesn't mean anything.
Never heard of it. So let's describe what the JCs were,
Well,
because I joined for a little while.
Yeah, well, the JC is very interesting because the JC.
It means junior.
Well, it was a lot of people when they heard the word Junior Chamber of Commerce thought that it was a division of the Chamber of Commerce.
Of each town.
Right. It never was. It was a name that was accepted by a group of young men in St. Louis, Missouri, over 75 years ago. And they started an organization, and it was an organization of young men between the ages of 21 and 35.
Okay.
Eventually, there was an international organization that was created. But when the international organization was created, the membership was 18 to 40, and men and women.
So when was that? What year was that? Do you know?
Yes, it was started right after, in 1945, right after the war, 1946.
But I mean, when it went to this age difference.
Well,
because when I was
it was
there,
international. The international in different countries.
Yeah.
The parameters were within the ages of 18 and 40. You could have further restrictions. The USJCs, it was just men 21 to 35.
Oh, okay.
Until it went to the Supreme Court of the United States.
What year was that?
In the early 80s. And it went to the Supreme Court, and 3 of the justices had to recuse themselves because they had been JCs. And the organization was forced to start accepting women. And they did.
Now, when I was in JCs and you got to be 35, you were a rooster?
An exhausted rooster.
Exhausted rooster.
That's
there you
right.
go.
And
35 years old, you're out.
That's right, because it was intended then that you would use that experience and go to other organizations like Lions or Rotary or Kiwanis or something.
Yeah.
The strength of it was that it was an organization dedicated on what the principles were. It's very important. 2 things. Leadership development, the development of the individual, regardless of what profession he's in. And the development of the community, doing something for the community that you lived in.
So you were Like public speakers, you learn how to speak in public.
You had some of us in JCs who could speak better than others. We had members in the Fort Kent JCs here who had a very difficult time just getting up, speaking amongst JCs. So the JCs had programs, and they had people, working with them where you could learn how to be a better speaker. And if you needed, but you see, it was an organization that at that time was leadership development and community development. And it was the same thing around the world, but interpreted differently in different countries.
Oh, okay. So the JCs are international.
They're international.
You mean world, all over?
All over. Now, you see, at the time, when I said that while I was here at the high school, I got that the first year, the school board gave me permission, gave me a week, it was 10 days, to go to Oklahoma City, because the USJCs needed someone that could speak French to try to help put a stop to this thing in Canada, splitting up.
All right.
The following year, the World Congress was in Sydney, Australia, and the United States JCs had a candidate for president of the World Organization from Alaska. And I had made, of course, a lot of friends in Oklahoma City with the Europeans and the Africans.
Who spoke French?
Who all spoke French, and here was an American that spoke French.
So that's an oddity.
This was the thing. So the USJCs then, and Ed Murdy's, who's a big multimillionaire oil guy, they said, boy, it's going to be a tough race in Australia between Murdy's and a guy from Argentina. So the USJC Executive Committee contacted me, and they wanted me to pay all my expenses to go to the World Congress. But then it was 3 weeks that I had to take off. So again, I had to go see Andy Frechette and the school board. Fortunately, a lot of people on the school board were former JCs too, and they let me go. They got a substitute teacher to come in. So in 1965, I went to Australia. 1966, Kyoto, Japan. 1967, the World Congress was in Toronto. So it was just a week there that I had to take, like it had been with Oklahoma City. So Andy Frechette would always say, holy boy, where's that darn meeting next year? She said, next year, Argentina, they don't need French there, that's Spanish. I'm not going. Andy says, I think you've pushed your luck on this a little far for 4 years.
Did you have anything to do with Quebec, the French Canadians not splitting from the others?
With the JCs, yes.
Yeah, you did function there.
Yes, and I made a lot of friends.
T'as pas fait d'ennemis et tout?
No, but I had a lot of friends in Quebec, still people that I have contact with today, who are part of the separatist movement. And we had some very interesting discussions.
Pense bien.
But the thing with the JCs, with the international, you see, is I went on the international level, I made a lot of friends. And the international headquarters of JCs, at that time, JCs was in about 90 countries outside of the United States. And the international JCs is set up like United Nations, with a Secretary General and a General Assembly. And this guy, who had been president of the Australia JCs when I went to Sydney in 1965, became the Secretary General position could only be held for 3 years, and one nationality cannot succeed another. So this Australian friend was after me to go join the staff of the international organization in Miami. And I was not interested because I had a teaching position I enjoyed. I was thinking of going on to do graduate studies, and I had my summer business with the tours. But he always told me, I said, what would it take? I says, well, what it would take would basically be a lot of travel. I don't want to sit in an office in Miami. So in 1968, I'm running a bus tour. I have a bus tour in Chicoutimi, We used to go up to Chicoutimi and take the Saguenay River down back to Quebec. I get a call from the Chateau Frontenac that this guy in Miami is trying to contact me. It's urgent. So I said, well, okay, when I get back to Quebec, I'll call him. And it was this friend of mine, this Australian, and he said, listen, I have just finished negotiating with Pepsi-Cola Foundation for a $250,000 grant to have someone travel around the world for 3 years, starting JC chapters where they do not exist. Because Donald Kendall, who was the president of Pepsi-Cola at that time, wanted to overtake Coca-Cola on the international level. And he figured what better way of going into a new country to start a bottling plant, to start hiring or identifying with young men and women who believe in the principles of the JCs, the JC Creed we had. Free enterprise. Economic justice can best be won by free men through free enterprise. Kendall had never been a JC, but he saw the value of that. So, I'm offered this grant to go based in Miami, but to travel around the world for 3 years. And so I called up Andy Frechette again, and he says, I hope you're not calling to tell me that they want you to go to Argentina. I says, no, Andy, it's a little more serious. I want you to release me from my contract. So he says, oh, you can't turn down this opportunity. And he says, I'll tell you what, teach in the month before the harvest, and we'll get another teacher in there. So in September of 1968, I went from northern Maine, from Fort Kent, to Coral Gables, Florida. And I was there for 13 years, 10 years traveling around the world with money from Pepsi-Cola, twice renewed, $250,000, then another $150,000, and then from the Toyota through the Japanese JCs, I started getting money from Toyota. And that's what permitted me to travel into countries where we started new JC organizations. While I was traveling, because of my interest in political geography and world affairs, I visited as many countries, as I could.
What an opportunity.
Oh, it was a fantastic opportunity. And I was going to leave because, you see, the international organization has got a maximum age of 40. So after 10 years, I had, 3 years left, but I was all set. I decided to come to Washington, not to come all the way back to northern Maine and not to go back to education, but to come to Washington. It was going to be an interesting period. This was right after the bicentennial. And the USJCs...
1976.
In 1976, the USJCs wanted me to be a candidate for Secretary General.
Of the JCs.
Of JCs International. So there were 40 candidates, and from 40 different countries, it was cut down to 5 candidates. I was the US candidate, and I was finally selected, and for a 3-year term, which would also happen to coincide with my 40th birthday. So,
which was the age limit.
By the time that I turned 40 in November of 1979, they had already selected the person who was going to replace me.
So you were the top CEO of JC's
the Secretary General, right. Every year.
Which meant what?
Well, it's an organization worldwide at that time of 600,000 young men and women in over 100 countries.
Wow. T'étais toi le boss?
No, c'était boss of the international headquarters. You see, we had a General Assembly. Each country had a seat in the General Assembly. You had a World Congress each year, and then you had 4 regional meetings. And you had a board of directors of 24 and an executive committee of 7. I was part of the executive committee and part of the board of directors, but I worked for the organization, you see. But I ran the headquarters of a staff of 35 from 14 different countries.
You attended all these things.
Yeah, I attended and traveled around the world, and well, even before I became Secretary General, with a lot of countries, you know, it was to their advantage to, you know, to let the leaders know that they were part of this large organization. And, you know, from Japan, where I had the opportunity of meeting the Emperor Hirohito when he was still living before his son came over.
Really?
And then his son and the crown princes, because the Japan, after the United States JCs, the Japan Junior Chamber is the most powerful in JCI.
Now that sounds like the United Nations almost.
That's exactly what it was based on the concept of the United Nations. And we had a very close working relationship with the United Nations. In fact, the last $150,000 grant that I got was from the Pepsi-Cola Foundation, was to have JC organizations in their different countries work very closely with UNICEF, which is the United Nations Organization for Children. So I got, you know, I've known most of the Secretaries General, and through that, you know.
So this opportunity that you had, starting here in Fort Kent with the JCs,
right?
And you're touring because of your French.
The
you know?
French is the key. Being able to speak French is the key to everything. It's what got me the job with Casser Tours.
Yeah.
It's because of Casser Tours where I got to know a lot of other JCs in different countries. It's because of being able to speak French that the United States, that I went to Oklahoma City, to Sydney, Australia, to Kyoto, Japan, to Toronto while I was still teaching. It's because of, you know, a lot of people from the Valley who spoke French. We grew up speaking French without having a disadvantage. It was bilingualism.
Without knowing it.
Without knowing it, basically. Unfortunately, a lot of people were, I wouldn't say ashamed. A lot of people thought, well, we don't speak the right French or something. There's no such thing. And to me, one of the most important things for me, you know, so through JC's International, and until I got to the international level, I remember this has got to be now in the early 1970s, probably 72, 71 or 72. I was going to speak in Africa, in Abidjan, at a conference where we had, of course, simultaneous interpretation. But I was flying to France, to Paris, and then meeting a French JC, and then going down to Abidjan. And he contacted me and he said, look, instead of just coming to Paris on like a Tuesday, why don't you come early? Come on the weekend before, because I want to take you to my hometown. I want you to meet my father and mother. He says, I've told them about this American that speaks French and is Acadien. And he said, my father is so interested and they want you to know. So we went, and I spent the weekend in Auxerre. And Jean-Pierre Ressa's father, such a lovely, so he said to me, well, I think the day before we were leaving, he says, oh, you know, and while we were speaking French, you know, I was trying to speak as well as something, if I thought he understood most of what I was saying, you know, because I had improved it a little over the years. But, you know, he'd ask questions if I'd say something. So he said to me the day before we were leaving, he says, oh, you know, boy, the Africans are going to be so, and everyone else, he says, you know, to see an American speaking at this international conference, an American speaking French. Oh, she said, I'm not speaking. She said, no, we have simultaneous interpretation. But he looked at me. He says, you've got to promise me that you're going to speak French. And he says, listen, your French, this business, là, Parisian French, là, he says there's 7 different major dialects in France. And he says the important thing is to be able to make yourself understood. So he says you're making yourself understood very well. And he says never hesitate to speak. And he says even if you have simultaneous interpretation, speak in French and let them translate it in the other language. He says you're going to, and boy, until we got in the car to drive back to Paris, he kept telling me, "Fais mieux de parler français," and I did, and you know it was appreciated, and so I've never had a hang-up. And if I was speaking to someone in French and if they didn't understand, I'd ask them what it was they didn't understand. I'd try it again.
Yeah. So it opened up a lot of doors.
Oh, it opened up a lot of doors because then, when I left the JCs, when I had to leave the JCs because I was 40 and I just finished my maximum tour, I decided to come to Washington. This was 1980. This was the Reagan Administration. And the JCs used to be, on the national level, they were very much involved in national politics. And Democrat and Republican national conventions, in many cases, were run by former JCs. The JC national conventions were a training ground. So I had, within the USJCs, had also the political experience because I found out that there had never been a president of the USJCs from New England. And a friend of mine from the JCs from Boston, who's still one of my closest friends today and now was a big insurance lobbyist, now lives in the Washington area. He and I decided we were going to do something about this, and we ran a campaign, and in 1967 we elected, it's going to be 40 years next year, the first and the only guy from New England to have served as the president of the USJCs at a convention in Baltimore when we had 17,000 JCs attending a national convention. And there were 5 candidates for national president. 3 of them were better friends of mine than this guy from Vermont. But I knew that if we wanted this guy to elect this guy from Vermont, we had to do it on the first ballot. And we did it.
Now, you say you were not president, or you were CEO of the JCs. That's different.
JCs International.
Oh, okay.
See, not the USJCs.
All right.
In the USJCs, I served on the board of directors, and then I was their translator, interpreter in international functions. But I made friends in the U.S., all around the country. And so in 1980, when Reagan was elected and was coming to Washington, a lot of the people that he brought into the government were JCs, and a lot of people that I knew. So when I came up to Washington, my tour finished in 1980. I came to Washington, and in 1981, I looked at different. I had friends who, were after me to go to different parts of the government. I wanted to do something in foreign affairs and related to State Department. And then one day, a friend of mine in the White House called me up, and he said, "Listen, do me a favor." He says, "I know you probably, don't want to go to Africa, and I don't know what you know about Peace Corps, but," he said, "there's a woman who is the director of the Peace Corps that has been after us because we're not coming up with political appointments that speak French to go to Africa." He said, "Do me a favor and at least meet with her, and you buy me some time, and if you do that, and I owe you one." And I owe you one in political jargon in Washington is, you have a special little box that you collect IOUs and you swap them.
Yeah.
So, but again, a change in my career. I said, well, who is this woman? And he says, well, you know Miller beer? Yeah, sure, you've drank Miller beer. Well, she's the heiress of the Miller beer fortune. Her husband is a congressman, and she's just been named the director of the Peace Corps. So I went to have lunch with her, and boy, she talked me into going with Peace Corps and going to Africa.
This is 1980.
This is 1980, but in 81.
81. Were you in Washington, just a side note here, when Reagan got shot?
Yes.
You were there?
Yeah. Yeah.
That must have been quite a shock there. That must have been quite a...
Yes, it was.
How did Washington react to that, huh?
People didn't know. And you know that for many years people didn't realize how serious it was. But let me tell you an interesting sideline. There's a girl from the St. John Valley here, a young woman, who was an emergency room nurse at the George Washington Hospital, and when they brought Reagan in, he collapsed in her arms.
Wow.
And for 5 years, under a decree of a federal judge, she, another nurse, and a doctor were prohibited from talking about how close Reagan came to dying. It was first for 3 years, then it was extended for 2 years, under penalty of going to jail.
Really?
Yeah, Jean Marquis. Jean Marquis. She had been a Peace Corps volunteer, and she was working, and when the Secret Service brought him in, and they were trying to get him into the emergency room, and so Reagan came very, very close.
C'est-tu ce qu'elle tenait, Jean Marquis?
Oui, elle venait ici, là, in Watergrass or something.
Really?
Yeah. She's an inshore, and she was a Peace Corps, someone that you would know, Odette Levac de Frenchville, fille de Dr. Levac.
Oui.
Okay? Odette Levac and Jean were both volunteers twice in Africa. In Sierra Leone, they were both nurses. They went to Sierra Leone, then they came back and did graduate studies in nursing, and then they went back in the Peace Corps and they went to the Congo. And then Jean was working. Odette, elle, went to work for the Veterans Administration, and where she still is or is about to retire. And Jean was emergency room at the George Washington University Hospital. So
we took a little break there, and I just thought, in passing, you said you met Emperor Hirohito of Japan?
Yes.
Who is dead now, but his son is...
his son, who was then Crown Prince, and is now the Emperor.
The Emperor.
And I've met him as Crown Prince, and I've met him as his Emperor. I have some... because the Japan JCs are very powerful. In fact, the current Foreign Minister of Japan, Taro Aso, is a very good friend of mine. Someone that I met when I first went to Japan in 1966, before I was with the International JCs, when I went to the Kyoto Congress. So, no, through JCs International, I met a lot of interesting people. Hirohito and Akihito are just two examples, but a lot of presidents of countries and prime ministers, and then I had the honor and the opportunity of meeting two of the popes in private audience, and then John Paul II I met a second time in an audience with my mother, when my mother was in 1984.
I think I saw a picture of that.
Yes, in 1984, when I was living in Africa, my mother went with a group from Fort Kent with Father Nicknair.
Oh, yeah.
And I had told her, well, to encourage her to go on the tour. She was a little hesitant because she was going to be the oldest one. I said, look, if you go, I'll go meet you in Rome and spend the time with you in Rome. And of course, this is the time where I cashed in some IOUs with my Italian JC friends. And also with, when I was living in Ouagadougou, the first Catholic African cardinal was from Ouagadougou. And Cardinal Zongrana had requested a private audience. He had requested the possibility of our attending the Pope's private Mass that morning and then a private audience afterwards. And then I figured, boy, I'm going to cash in some of my Italian IOUs with the people who had set up the private audiences with Paul VI and with John Paul II before. And, for once, they all came through. Because when I checked in with the papal secretarial office, they said, "Oh, Mr. Bouchard, we know you live in Africa, but you also have Italian contacts because we have requests from the Cardinal of Ouagadougou and the Cardinal of Naples, and the Cardinal of Milan." And we were not, it's an interesting story, we did it was a private Mass for some Polish friends that morning, so we didn't go to his private Mass in his private chapel. But after the general audience, where he receives 20 people, we did, and there are some excellent photos, and he knew very well that knew that I was in Ouagadougou and referred to Cardinal Zongrana and to the development work in Africa, and
he knew all that.
He knew well. His secretary is always behind him, saying, but
telling him
since I had been in before, I knew how the papal photographers work, so I had them snapping away pictures. I ended up getting 12 fantastic pictures.
And then you were there with your mother that time.
So that was the second time that
So you had an audience with Pope Paul VI?
The private audience with him, and private audience with John Paul II, with the president of the Italian Junior Chamber. And it's in both cases. And then, of course, many European and African and Asian presidents. When I was setting up these world congresses every year, and we did 10 or 11 of them, these people were always, our principal speakers, and I'd go there before, and so I've had the opportunity of meeting many interesting people over there.
So that was when you were JC CEO.
Well, basically with JCs, and then when I went with the government, there it was basically Africa concentrated. With JC's International, it was worldwide.
Oh, okay.
But with State Department and with Peace Corps, it was basically Africa.
I think we were talking about that when we took our break, that you met this lady.
The woman who was the director of the Peace Corps talked me, Lorette Miller-Rupi talked me into going to Africa, and there was a presidential appointment, and
Reagan?
Under Reagan, I had 4 presidential appointments, and 2 under Reagan, and 2 under President Bush, 41, as far as Peace Corps, and after Peace Corps, the African Development Foundation. So that was my concentration on Africa. But when I moved in 1982 to Africa with State Department, I went to a country that was then called Upper Volta, Haute-Volta, in the north-central middle of Africa, with desert all around it. And in a 3-year period there, I had 3 coups d'etat, 5 changes of government, and the last revolutionary leader decided to change the name of the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso.
Oh, yeah.
Because he said Upper Volta, Haute Volta, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? It's a river. Doesn't mean anything. The French looked at a map, said, on va appeler ça la Haute Volta. So he created the name himself that represented the African people living there. And he created the name Burkina, and Burkina, in one of the native languages, means the home of, the dwelling of. And Faso is brave and upright And so Burkina Faso means the home of brave.
There's a hyphen between the two words. No, there
no
isn't.
hyphens, but the space, it's 2 words.
It's 2 words.
Yeah.
T'étais là dans ce temps-là, toi?
Well, I was there 3 years.
T'es des Français, ça, là.
Ben, c'était français, puis then they have their native languages, you see. But French, since French used to be the colonial power,
Yeah.
the main language is French.
That's how government speaks.
Government speaks, and everything is done in French.
C'était-tu les dictateurs qu'il y avait là?
We, in Burkina Faso, it was military, basically. You'd say they'd have coups, they'd overthrow one.
T'es dans heureux pour toi, ça?
Ben, the embassy, we were pretty well. My biggest concern was, I had 125 Peace Corps volunteers throughout the country. I mean, our instructions were to them would stay in your villages because the people will protect you.
Okay.
And in our particular case, it wasn't violent revolutions. They'd overthrow each other during the night or something. And, you'd have curfews. Of the 3 years I was there, most of the time, you could not be out after 8 o'clock at night and until 4 o'clock in the morning.
Really?
No,
most of the time?
Yeah, most of the time, yeah. So, and then the second 3 years that I was in Africa, there it was in Dakar, Senegal. And Senegal is a country on the Atlantic Ocean, and it's richer, although it's still a poor country. And the interesting thing with Senegal is that to this day, all of these African countries started having their independence in the early 1960s. And, sometimes we forget it's only been 45 years for them, and some of them even less than that. And we're critical of things not moving fast enough. But we should stop and reflect on our own history. And, but in Senegal, to this day, it's one of only 3 countries in Africa that has never had a military takeover or a non-democratic process. They've had elections. You had one election, one person who was president elected for 20 years, and then you elected 4 times, 5-year terms, and then others, and then the second one, lost, and he stepped aside. Military didn't get involved. So, but I've been traveling with the JCs before, and then with State Department. I've been on every country on the African continent and all of the island countries. And I still remain very optimistic about Africa. Sometimes things are not moving as quickly as we'd like them to, but
right now, in what's that country we were in? We had to get out on the west coast, on the east coast.
On the west coast, on the east coast, Somalia.
Somalia, yeah.
Yes.
Oh
yeah, that's a tough.
You wouldn't want to be there.
No, you wouldn't want to be there now. But that used to be a beautiful country.
Really?
In fact, something. There's someone from Fort Kent, Rosaire Martin, one of my good friends. Rosaire Martin was a Peace Corps volunteer in Somalia.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, he was an education. He was an education teacher there. We went to school together in the mid-60s. Rosaire was a Peace Corps volunteer. It used to be a beautiful country. I've gone in and out of Mogadishu. And now it's total disaster. There's no government. It's all warlords, one tribe or one section of a tribe, in fact, fighting against each other. So it's
right now
it's very difficult.
The Muslims are taking over, I think.
Well, in that particular part of Africa, because northern Africa and eastern Africa has basically more of a Muslim influence. When you go down into Central Africa and Southern Africa, it's then there are some Muslims, but they're not in the majority. It's not predominant. Because the African tribes, a lot of them have moved into, Christianity. You've had a lot of missionaries there for a while. And but they also retain their tribal principles, which is good. And it's when you can see it. There was an excellent example given to me once by this Catholic cardinal of Ouagadougou, Zongrana.
Where was that?
When I was with Peace Corps in Ouagadougou, the first African Catholic cardinal.
And what is Ouagadougou? That's capital?
Ouagadougou is the capital of Burkina Faso.
Oh, okay. Upper Volta.
The old Upper Volta. So Cardinal Zongrana, I said to him one night, we were at a diplomatic reception, and I said, Your Eminence, in the paper today, the little newspaper, I saw that someone had died, and it said, El Hajj Omar Ouedraogo. So El Hajj means he's Muslim, and that he has made the pilgrimage to Mecca.
Uh-huh.
And I started reading, and it said, I knew that he was a big merchant in Ouagadougou. And it said that there would be a high mass of requiem conducted by Cardinal Zongrana in the cathedral at such and such a time, followed by tribal festivities in the village. So I said, Your Eminence, this is interesting to me. Here's a person, El Hajj. He said, yes. And I said, you're celebrating a mass for him? He says, yes, he's one of my closest friends. And then I says, everyone going to the village for the traditional dances and festivities. He says, well, you have to understand, when we were young, we were all brought up in the tribal situation. And the missionaries came in, and they chose some of us to educate. And he says, in my case, I was educated. I went to a seminary, I became a priest, I became a bishop, I'm now a cardinal. In the case of my friend Omar, he became a merchant. And he figured it was to his advantage as a merchant to be a Muslim, to deal with all of the people. And he made a trip to Mecca, so he said, Hajj Omar. And he says, afterwards, we will all leave the cathedral, and we'll all go to the village about an hour away, and we'll drink, the local drink, and enjoy the dances. So it's just one example of the wonders of Africa and the complexity.
So you enjoyed it over there?
Oh, I enjoyed it, and I've kept going back because, you see, after I spent 6 years, after the first 2 presidential appointments, I then received the 3rd presidential appointment, but back in Washington, to be ahead of all of the Africa region. And there I did that again, and that position, again, every country that I would visit to, I'd either meet the president or the prime minister, because all of the countries that had Peace Corps volunteers really enjoyed Peace Corps volunteers, because Peace Corps volunteers are the best representatives the United States can have in any country, because they go into a country and, they don't live in apartments. They go live in the village and live with the people.
They really help out.
They really help out. So the countries that had volunteers wanted to make sure that we kept continuing to send them, and the ones that didn't have volunteers were always pleading and begging, for us to do so. So the years, first of all, with JC's International, in about 20 of the 50 African countries, then the years with Peace Corps living in Burkina Faso and in Senegal, where I also was responsible for starting Peace Corps in 5 other neighboring countries, were very interesting. And
you lived there.
I lived there for 6 years.
You were like in Burkina Faso. You were there 3 years.
3 years.
And you stayed there?
I stayed there. I had lived. I was, part of the embassy. Lived In both places, I chose not to live in what we call diplomatic compounds. I got permission from the ambassador to go live in African neighborhoods. I lived in places where I was the only non-African.
Really?
Yes, not far away.
T'étais-tu en danger?
No, never. In fact, you are safer in a situation like that because the Africans, it's like I used to tell my Peace Corps volunteers, if you wake up in the morning at 5 o'clock to martial music, you know there's been a coup. Stay in your villages. Don't start getting on a motorcycle coming to Ouagadougou. The African people, they're very poor, but they're very, very hospitable.
Well, we heard, not there, but where these rebels or whatever would come in and cut everybody's hands off and arms and kill and...
Yeah, these are two countries that used to be peaceful countries, Sierra Leone and Liberia. And it's unfortunate that rebel forces, took over those countries. Now there's an attempt to stabilize the government in Liberia. You now have the first African woman to be elected president of a country, and she's a woman that I have known for years.
Where's that?
In Liberia.
Liberia.
Yeah, Augusta Sirleaf, and I knew her when she was in Liberia as a government minister, and then when they had military coups, she went to the United Nations, and then in fact I was at a reception and dinner for her in Washington about 6 weeks ago, and hopefully she can bring peace and stability back to that country. Because what has happened is terrible with arming
what's his name
7
there?
and 8-year-old boys.
Yeah, what's his name there?
Taylor.
Taylor, yeah.
Taylor, and who is now in the Netherlands at the International Court in The Hague.
Right.
And he will never go back to Africa.
Nigeria seems quite
Nigeria
dangerously
is a very complex, not dangerous in
is there
as
a
much
Christian
as other countries. The thing with Nigeria is the riches of the oil production.
Yeah.
And you have military coups that take over. Years ago, in the early 60s, you had the war in Biafra there, we saw horrible. It was the first time that photographers really portrayed atrocities and starving children and people being killed and everything else. Since then, you've had military coups, but what happens is military rulers come in and they steal most of the money, of the oil money in the government. And then, another officer doesn't think he's getting his fair share, and he turns around and he overthrows, and someone else comes over. Now they've had a person who used to be a military ruler who came back and was elected, and he's had 2 terms.
Isn't there a Muslim Christian?
Yes, big. In the northern part, in the desert area, you have very strong Muslim. You still have the old sultanates.
Oh, yeah.
And like you remember reading about, like in the Middle East, these people, absolute rule and everything else. And then in the southern part, which is basically through missionaries has become more Christian, there is conflict, but it's political conflict. Of who runs what part of the legislature. They try to share.
More than religious.
More than religious, yeah. Tribal.
Now, we're coming back from there. You're back in Washington. What year was that?
I came back. I came back in '87, and as a regional director. But as a regional director
of the Peace Corps.
Yes, I was still back on the continent 10 days out of the month. I was on the African continent, but skip and hopping with
different countries.
Different countries.
Now you were after that. What happened? You went in Washington.
You see, Peace Corps also has, even if it's political appointments, Peace Corps, when it was created, they did not want to see the creation of a bureaucracy when it was created by President Kennedy. So they put a 5-year limit. They said 2.5 for staff, 2.5-year tours. And then Congress, after the 20th anniversary, made it possible to extend that by 1 year. And after the 25th anniversary, Congress made it possible to have a third 2.5-year tour, but with special restrictions, meaning only if you took someone who was in the field and brought them to Washington management, or took someone from Washington management and put them in the field. I was the third person in the history of Peace Corps to serve 8.5 years, which was absolute maximum by congressional decree. And once you served 8.5 years, you have to stay out 8.5 years before you could go back to Peace Corps, which was a good thing to do. But in my very last year as regional director, I also went through a serious medical problem where I had cancer. I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I had been told that I may have 15 to 18 months of chemotherapy. And fortunately, in 3 months of chemotherapy, the tumor that I had was gone.
What year was that? I remember hearing about that.
This was in 1989. And I still say to this day, you know, everyone deals with cancer in a different way. But in my particular case, I think that one of the psychological factors that helped is that I chose a medical center right close to my office, and I never took a day off.
Oh.
And I had a very good staff, but I was still putting in, even if I'd go in for treatments for 2.5, 3 hours a day, I'd still finish my 12 hours, you know, at the office. And I think it was because of the work that I was doing. I never gave myself too much time to think. And when I'd go for my treatment, I'd walk in with my briefcase. It would disturb some of the doctors, and especially the oncology nurses, because I'd come in with 3 hours of work, and I would not lie down on the bed to take my treatments. I'd sit in a recliner, and I'd have them, and boy, I'm going to tell you, I'd be there when it opened at 8 o'clock, and at 11 o'clock I wanted them to unplug me so I could get back to the office. So it was very good, but I told the White House at that time that I wanted to take a break, and that I wanted to take 3 months off, and but then I would speak to them about another appointment, and they had agreed to that. But my last day at Peace Corps was on a Friday, and the Monday morning at 9 o'clock the phone rings, and it's the White House, and they said, "Oh, Mr. Bouchard," it was an assistant to the person that I knew very well there. "We know we have an arrangement with you, but something has come up, and could you please meet with someone? There's an African Development Foundation that has been created by Congress, and we have to change the president and the vice president there. And we'd like you to meet with someone." And at that time, so I agreed to go to lunch with a great old gentleman in Washington who just recently died at 94, but he was one of the founders of the CIA during the Second World War. It was OSS, and he met with me at lunch and said, "Listen, we'd like to place, this foundation is independently run. It's not under State Department, it's part of the U.S. government. We want an African American as president. that the two previous presidents have been African American. And this guy that we want to put in does not know much about Africa. He's a preacher minister. And so we want to have a very strong vice president. All of the two previous vice presidents had been African Americans also. And we'd like you to consider this. I was a little surprised. I said, well, basically out of respect to Mr. Fitzgerald, can I speak to you tomorrow? And then when I spoke to some of my close friends at State Department, the first two I spoke to said, don't consider that. You're going to get crucified. I mean, this is political African American. The Black Caucus is going to be raising holy hell if that seat goes to.
You'd be the only white man there.
Right. But the third person I spoke to said, listen, that's exactly what they need. And he says that there's a person I know who can pull this off. Now, if I remember correctly, you came to visit me in my office.
Yeah.
And I don't know, had I introduced you, was the president there at the time?
No.
He probably wasn't.
But
he was out preaching most of the time. I ran the place.
Yeah.
and had a good staff. But what happened, of course, at the time of the political change, with the Clinton administration coming in 92, if I would have been at Peace Corps or any other place in government, when Clinton was sworn in at noontime, I had to be gone. But since the African Development Foundation was not run directly by the White House, it was run by a board of directors who had been nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The composition of the board of 7 board members, the ones who selected me and who wanted me, was 4 Republicans, and then there were 3 Democrats. But the Republicans were in majority. So, to get rid of me, or basically to ask for my resignation, they had to change the composition of the board from 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats to 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. I thought that it would take 3 to 4 months. It took them 3 years. And I stayed. And then, I left. And then I stayed on as an independent consultant, basically through State Department with different agencies of the government.
So that's what you've been doing there in Washington still?
Yes. But the last 6 years were not in presidential appointments. It was as
You've been living in Washington then for years and years.
When I left JC's International in 1980, that's when I moved to Washington. So I've been in Washington since 1980.
Plus
1981.
But in Africa.
In Africa, it was living up those 26 years. 6 years I lived on the continent. But most of the other time has been traveling back to Africa.
Now, you're retired now.
I just retired when I was going to reach 65, which also coincided with the election, the 2004 election. I had mentioned before that I've always been a Republican. And I had those 4 presidential appointments, through the political side. But most of my friends in Washington are Democrats. But I got very frustrated with the foreign policy and with State Department in the first Bush the son administration. I was very disturbed when the Defense Department started doing a lot of things, especially in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, that they were never basically in the past intended to. It was responsibilities that were basically State Department and diplomatic responsibilities. I had a very difficult time with that. I supported the administration in most of the domestic programs, but again, I've never been a far-right Republican. I'm a centrist Republican, which makes me in many ways as Democrat as most Democrats.
You mentioned a while ago, off camera, that Washington has changed, not for the better, according to...
Oh, no. This is exactly the thing. It started changing about 10 years ago. And a good example of the beginning of the change is when Bill Cohen decided not to seek re-election as to the Senate. And I remember that very well because we were having a Maine State Society function, and one of Bill's aides came to ask 5 or 6 of us to wait a few minutes after the function that Bill wanted to speak to us. And he told us that he decided that he was not going to seek. And he said at that time, and he has since said publicly several times, Washington is no longer what it used to be. When he says, when I came to Washington as a congressman, I had friends on both sides of the aisle, and we worked together. And he says, now that is no longer going on. And he says, I'd rather remember the old years. And then his close Democratic friend, Senator Nunn from Georgia, had made a similar announcement about 3 or 4 months before. So that's when it started to change. In the second Clinton administration, it started polarizing more against, you know, if you're a Republican, you can't support the Democrats on this, and if you're a Democrat, you can't support the Republicans on this. And that is unfortunate because it has torn Congress, well, it's not only Congress, and we have to remember that there are 3 branches of government, but let's put the Supreme Court aside and talk about the Congress and the White House. They have to work together. This animosity, which has gotten worse over the past 2 or 3 years, is just not good for the country.
Well, you're saying that it's not good for the country.
It's not good for the country. And
do you see what's going to happen?
Well, I'll tell you what, I've shocked some of my Republican friends where I've said for 2 years now that I hope that in this election in November that the Republicans lose control of the House. Because I don't like this, I don't think it's good for the country to have the House and the Senate and the White House in the same party. Yeah, I mean, that was done for years, but at least people were civil to each other then. And you don't have that now. And without getting into too straight politics, I say to my friends, let the Democrats have it now. The Republicans would get the House back in 2008 because it's not going to be any better. And there's right now the leadership in the House. I mean, we had Tom DeLay. At least we got rid, and the system got rid of Tom DeLay.
Yeah.
The Democrats have Nancy Pelosi. Let Nancy Pelosi be Speaker of the House for 2 years, and the Republicans will get the House back in 2008. On the Senate side, you've got the same situation. They don't have, neither party is represented by the best. Yeah. And you know, on the Tonight Show, Jay Leno about 6 weeks ago had Senator McCain on, and he. You know, when the political people appear on these shows, they kind of have an agreed upon script. But at the very beginning, the minute Jay Leno said, Senator, I want to put that aside. I want to talk to you. You've been in Washington for a while. What has happened? Why is Washington in the sorry state as far as the political leaders that it is now? And McCain says, you know, I'm glad that you asked that because people ask me that as I travel around the country. And he says, here's what I think happened. He says, when I first came to Congress, as a young congressman from Arizona, he says, I moved my family to Washington put my kids in school, and once a month I would go back to Arizona. Sometimes my wife would come with me, sometimes she wouldn't. But he says the other weekends we would socialize with congressmen and with senators and other leaders of government and other friends. And we had friends, and it wasn't a party thing. He says now the situation has changed completely. Senators and congressmen, most of them don't bring their families to Washington. They leave their families in their districts. They come to Washington on a Tuesday morning because there's no vote before Tuesday afternoon. And Thursday noon is the last vote. So they're on a plane again, and they're in their districts.
They don't talk to each other.
And they don't talk to, and he says it's the 2 days that we're in Washington, half of the time we see each other, we walk by each other in the hall, we don't even stop to talk, whether it's someone in your party or not.
Carroll, this is, you've been there and you told us how it is. So a guy from Fort Kent, c'est madame à River Street, to land at Washington, puis tu n'as vu des affaires. So anybody can do that if they want to, right? If they have
that's right.
The will.
If you have the will, and you know something, there are so many great advantages to have been brought up in an area like we've been brought up here. And the values, the family values, the community spirit, the opportunity of education here with the University of Maine at Fort Kent, and then the background and the culture that we have in French. People should not hesitate. It's to speak the French. The whole thing with any language, regardless what it is, as long as you can make someone understand what you're trying to convey. And in my case, it's French that open the opportunities.
So in your life, your second language has a lot of value.
Oh, it sure does have a lot of value.
Yeah.
And listen, I have spoken French with presidents and with prime ministers, and they all know I'm Franco-American. The current president, and still remaining president of France, that I'm now frustrated with at a certain time, I have met him on 2 different occasions, and we have spoken French, and he knows where I was pleased to tell him where I came from, because he knows the United States very well.
And he understood you, and you understood him.
Sure.
Well, that's a good message to leave to the Valley, Carroll.
Well,
Carroll Bouchard from Fort Kent, Maine, Washington, and really the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.